É prazer estar no Brasil pela primeira vez. É momento de grande potencial para reforma tanto no Brasil quanto nos Estados Unidos. Posso senti-lo aqui como sinto as possibilidades lá. Ambos nossos países se encontram para trás em educação. Espero que possamos avançar rapidamente juntos. Desculpe-me, mas vou continuar em inglês. But I wanted to start by thanking IFHC. I've just been reading the memoir of President Cardoso, and it's been an inspiration for me to read this. And I also wanted to thank the Lehman Foundation and Brava Foundation for inviting me here to talk. As I mentioned, I do think that there are a number of similarities between the education reform debate here in Brazil and the education reform challenge in the United States. And in my role at the Gates Foundation, we faced a very similar challenge to the challenge you're facing here, in the sense of, okay, of the many issues we could be working on the many aspects of education that need work, what is the lowest hanging fruit? What is the highest payoff intervention we could undertake? There are three areas where actually I think there is the greatest promise in the U.S. One is what I'll be talking about today, which is around providing better feedback to teachers on the work that they're doing in the classroom. A second one that I won't be talking about today, but which is just as important, is developing some common national standards, which I think is a huge issue here in Brazil, just as it has been in the U.S., where in the past each state has set their own standards rather than coming up with a common set of standards. And the Gates Foundation has been working hard on that issue in the U.S. A third area that we were talking about some at lunch today is, what is the possibility for using technology to increase the productivity of the time students spend in school? And I think there's a lot of exciting work going on right now in that area, and actually I think that would hold a lot of promise even for here in Brazil. But in focusing on teacher effectiveness, providing feedback to teachers, why is it that we find that to be such an important area for intervening? It comes from 40 years of research in the U.S. that has been telling us two things. One, that there are huge differences in student achievement gains in different teachers' classrooms. So all of us have a story about an individual teacher who had an impact on our lives, but I can actually see it in the data. Like, you can clearly see that there are some classrooms where students tend to see larger gains from one year to the next than in other classrooms. So there's lots of data that there are big differences between classrooms, even in the same school. So this is not just between schools, it's within the same schools. There are some classrooms that are seeing much larger gains than others. The second point that we've known for a long time is that those differences have very little to do with beginning credentials. So the teacher's qualifications while walking into the school. But it's almost as if we've designed the policies based on as if the facts were just the opposite. You know, it's almost as if we've taken those facts and designed policies around what just the opposite, you know, would imply. So why? Well, in our policies in the U.S., we focus have focused in the past, much of our effort on teachers' credentials coming into the classroom. So there's and there are tests teachers need to take before they come into the classroom. And we spend practically no time focusing on teachers' effectiveness in the classroom. So even though there's a probationary period before teachers get tenure in the United States, teacher evaluation almost everywhere is just a perfunctory exercise. Now, if the quality of instruction is so important, as we often say, I think I often see in U.S. literature, but then also in translations of some of the work here in Brazil, one often sees sentences like, teachers are the most important in-school factor for student learning, or teachers matter. Well, if teachers and teaching matter so much, why do we pay so little attention to it while people are in front of the classroom? And so the costs of ignoring those differences in practice are huge. Not just for the students, although that's obvious. It's also stunting for teachers' professional growth. And again, we see that in the data, that teachers improve their practice from their first to their second year, maybe to their third year, but then teachers quickly plateau after that. Similarly, principals make the most important decision, at least in the US, we ask them to make, which is to grant tenure to a young teacher after 2 or 3 years on the job. We expect them to make that decision with no evidence. We don't give them any systematic way to think about differences in practice and assess performance. So right now, there's an important movement underway in the U.S. There are 42 different states that have passed laws changing the way, the types of evaluation data that teachers get back. And hopefully, I don't know for sure that all of that will work. I don't know that it'll be implemented well. But I do know that there are lots of different states and districts working on this problem of giving more meaningful feedback and trying to evaluate performance on the job. So one thing I just wanted to show people is that I'm not talking about achievement at the end of the year as something to be measuring teachers on. I'm focusing on improvements in performance while a student is in a teacher's classroom. So here are 2 teachers. You don't just measure how they do at the end of the year. You look and see how much they grew during the course of the year. And when you do that, and you focus on the average gain in achievement, what you see is that there's a broad spread in the magnitude of those gains in different teachers' classrooms, but that the magnitude of the gains, the average gains, have very little to do with the initial certification teachers had. So these are data from Los Angeles, but as you can see, the number 5 there means that the average student in the class is improving 5 percentile points, moving ahead of 5% of students who had similar starting points. A -5 means that the classrooms were losing 5 percentile points relative to the average student. You might say, well, wait a minute, is that really a big effect? Well, the difference between +5 and -5 of 10 is, you know, a quarter of the black-white achievement gap in the U.S. closed in a single year. So these are quite large differences. Now, The second thing, and I just included this slide because it's a hot part of the debate in the U.S. People often say, but wait a minute, isn't this just about the nature of the people who are going into teaching? Isn't this just about trying to be much more selective at the front end in terms of who goes into teaching? Well, it could be, the answer might be very different here in Brazil. I'm not trying to suggest that all of this would apply to Brazil. But at least in the U.S., what this graph is suggesting is that these recruitment efforts are having modest effects on achievement. So this line here is the distribution of student achievement gains in classrooms taught by Teach for America teachers. So Teach for America is a very selective program. About 15% of the seniors from Harvard College, from Princeton University, from Yale apply to Teach for America. And actually a relatively small proportion of them are admitted. So it's a selective admission among the most selective students we have. So in some sense it's an upper bound. It's an extreme for the recruitment strategy. And there, even though there's a small positive difference in math, there's not a dramatic difference in the outcomes that they get, but there's a huge amount of spread within the Teach for America people, just like there's spread within the other groups. So it's not just at least in the U.S., it's not primarily an issue of recruitment. A third thing to note, this is just a graph showing what do the gains look like from the first to the second to the third year of teaching. And this is for the same group of teachers that we followed for 3 years and just plotted the distribution of their achievement gains in their first, their second, and their third year. Notice things shift to the right, especially from the first year to the second year. But things also, the distribution of effectiveness also spreads out. That's important because one possibility is that everybody, teachers become more alike as time passes, that some teachers get better and catch up. Well, what this graph is saying is no, actually people are becoming more different because the things are spreading out as they move from their first to their second to their third year, which, as is true in many professions, is that I bet it's true even in say football here in Brazil. People who start out better get better faster. You know, like if you've got a certain proclivity at something, you tend to pick it up faster. It's not so. This is what we're seeing, at least here, in terms of teacher effectiveness. Now, a fourth thing we're seeing, though, is, as I mentioned, is that teacher evaluations have been perfunctory. You know, that there's relatively little systematic look at practice among teachers. So, as I said, if teaching practice is so important, why do we ignore it? Even school systems are ignoring it. It's not just that voters don't pay enough attention to education. The quality of instruction is not something that school districts, at least in the U.S., have spent a lot of time focused on. The 98% of teachers would get the same satisfactory rating, and the 2% that were rated unsatisfactory, when we look at their achievement gains, they're not any worse than the people who are rated satisfactory. So it's the disconnect between these two that I think is so striking, that we find that there are huge differences between teachers that's hard to see before people start the job, and yet we pay no attention to performance on the job. Now, one of the tricky things is in figuring out, even if you start with the problem that, okay, yes, this is about teacher effectiveness, we need to figure out ways of reforming our policies around the effectiveness of individual teachers, it's a hard problem to figure out, okay, where do you intervene? So one possibility is to intervene in pre-service training, so in teacher training institutions. But as somebody who teaches in higher ed, I'm not optimistic about that strategy, just because you think it's hard to change elementary and secondary schools. Just wait till you try to change the universities. that universities are just very difficult animals to move. And if you, that's one potential strategy, but that would be a tough go. The Gates Foundation has decided not to do anything in pre-service training for now. The second place to go is to focus on recruitment. But as I said before, even though I think you can get some small bumps, at least in the U.S. on recruitment, that our evidence in the U.S. is not suggesting that we're going to be getting large effects there. Another place to focus is during this probationary period early in a teacher's career. Now, we often point to unions as being, in the U.S., we often point to unions as being a barrier. But I actually think that is letting school districts off the hook. The fact is, under many collective bargaining agreements, there is a probationary period during the first 2 or sometimes 3 years of a teacher's career when school districts do have the right to not renew a teacher's contract. Problem is, they waste that opportunity. They don't use that time to assess performance. Now, it's not just about making sure that people who are ineffective do not get tenure, because once they cross that threshold, it's much, much harder to do anything. It's also about making sure that the people who are highly effective are retained. So the key is, what's the difference in effectiveness between the people who cross the threshold and stay versus the people who don't? And one way to do that is by making sure more of your most effective people stay, and if you could do that with bonuses for the teachers who showed the greatest promise during their early years, that might be a way to ensure that, and not just focus on making sure that there's a high standard. That early part of a career I've just highlighted there is the period of high turnover. So in the U.S. back in the 90s, there were many states that were offering large bonuses to teachers who got what was called national board certification. So that there was an extra, they could submit videos of themselves teaching, they would take some tests, and if they passed those, they got an extra bonus. Now, to some extent, that was the right information at the wrong time, because most of the national board teachers were out here. Like the average applicant for national board certification was in their 13th year of teaching. Well, it may be fair, it may be nice, it may be equitable to give those teachers a bonus, but the fact is they're not leaving for the most part. So a 13-year veteran is very likely to stay the following year. Rather, if you'd given those bonuses earlier, if you'd identified who those high performers were earlier and offered them that bonus during the period of high turnover, then you could be having an effect on student achievement by trying to make sure that you retain more of them. Like, so the bonuses for people during this low turnover part of their career may be great, or maybe a nice thing to do, but is not the economist in me who focuses on incentives would say, well, that may be fair, but that's not the efficient thing to do. We could talk about that later, but okay. So I wanted to just speak for a second about why I think focusing during this probationary period is, even though it's not probably the top thing on most people's lists as an area of opportunity, I would just point to it as what I think is, for me, the lowest hanging fruit, or the policy that I wonder how lowest hanging fruit translates, but the policy that would have the biggest payoff for the least cost, and there are a few different reasons. One is at least in the U.S., that is an area, and as I understand, at least it may be true here, that probationary period is a period where school districts would have a lot more flexibility to make sure that they don't retain the least effective teachers. A second point is that that I think is an area potentially for common ground with the labor unions, at least in the U.S., that having a serious threshold, a serious bar for tenure, makes the thing that they care most about, that is job security for most of their members, more valuable, not less valuable. It builds legitimacy for tenure if tenure is a serious hurdle, as opposed to what it is now, which is just a perfunctory. There's no honor in achieving tenure if everybody gets if everybody ever hired always achieves tenure. A third reason is that and this is what I worry about in the U.S. Debate right now, is that all the school districts and states that are trying to implement these new evaluation policies are trying to implement them system-wide at the same time. So if this is not something that they've been doing well, and if they don't have the infrastructure to do, to try to take it on and in 1 year implement an evaluation for all of the teachers in the school system in 1 year, that's just a recipe for disaster. And so a third reason to focus in this area is you could focus on the 15% of the workforce that is in this probationary period and do a reasonable job of providing people feedback on the work that they're doing. And then fourth, given high turnover rates, focusing, so teachers, in most urban school districts, there are large numbers of teachers being hired every year. Given that, after a while, if you had a high threshold for tenure and had bonuses for keeping the really great teachers, you could potentially have a big impact on the average quality of the teaching force, and thereby making the turnover a friend rather than something that's costly. It turns it into a positive thing. Okay. Now, of course, one of the big problems, if you're going to do this immediately, is to say, okay, well, how do we provide feedback to teachers? What kind of feedback would be valid and reliable? What would we want to do if we were to do this? So the Gates Foundation funded a study called the Measures of Effective Teaching Project, which I have been directing. It's the largest study of instructional practice ever undertaken. So it's about a $50 million study that we've done in the last 3 years. We focused on 3,000 teachers in 6 different school districts in the U.S. And what we did in trying to decide, okay, what would we go about measuring? we sat down at the beginning and said, well, there are three different entities in the classroom. There's the teacher, there's the student, and there's the content. And we just wanted to make sure we had at least one measure on each side of that triangle. So we wanted to make sure we're measuring students' relationship to the content with the state assessments and other assessments. We wanted to measure students' relationship to their teacher using a student survey. That's the way I get evaluated every semester in higher education. So I'm a college professor. Actually, there are a couple of people here who've been in classrooms with me, so they got to fill these things out. And then teachers' relationship to the content with the test of pedagogical content knowledge. And we've been doing, and then finally we wanted to see how all three of those things came together by observing in classrooms. So I'm not, gonna drag you through all of these results. Here's just a picture of the camera that we used for doing the study. So we wanted to test a number of different approaches to doing classroom observations. So in each one of these classrooms, we had a camera set up for collecting video in the classroom, and then we went to see, okay, how did each of these approaches to doing classroom observations, what were the scores that teachers got on each of those approaches, and how were those scores related to other things like student achievement gains. So we didn't want to just have an opinion about what effective practice was. We wanted to test some different opinions. We used 5 different approaches to doing classroom observations, and we compared them. Now, we also did a student survey, and here are some of the questions that we asked. We asked students to agree, disagree to questions like, our class stays busy and doesn't waste time. Students in this class treat the teacher with respect. My teacher explains difficult things clearly. Here's one of the most predictive ones, was in this class we learned to correct our mistakes. So these questions were not just, does the student like the teacher? We asked students about specific aspects of practice, and we looked to see, one thing we didn't know was how well students could distinguish between teachers, or how much they would. So one possibility is that in every classroom there are a few grumpy people and a few happy people, but there's not much differences between different classrooms. That's not what we found, actually. We found that there are big differences in student responses in different teachers' classrooms. And among the things that we measured, it was among the most reliable, in the sense that the difference when a teacher's rating from one classroom was likely to be consistent with their rating in another classroom. So if a teacher taught 2 different groups of students, the students tended to say similar things about them. Yes, so Sergio just asked me what age. We focused on grades 4 to 9. So one reason for that was, when we started this, I had a 9-year-old boy who was in 4th grade, and he barely knew his teacher's gender at that point. So I was a little worried about asking children at younger ages, but surprisingly, I don't think my own son is representative. I think that it turns out that the students, even as young as 4th grade, showed a relationship with student achievement gains in terms of their responses. Okay. So here's just a quick summary of results so far. So first, if you're trying to find the teachers that are likely to have big student achievement gains working with another group of students. The best single predictor of that, among the things that we've looked at, so including classroom observations, student surveys, student achievement gains on state tests for another group of students, the best single predictor is student achievement gains with a different group of students. So having a track record of being able to see student achievement gains is the best predictor of whether or not you'll see student achievement gains when working with another group of students. It's not perfect. There is statistical noise in these measures, but of the single measures, it was the one that was most predictive. Second was that observers could identify practices which are associated with student achievement gains. So I mentioned we tested 5 different approaches to doing classroom observations. All 5 of them were related to student achievement gains. So trained observers could identify practices that were associated with student achievement gains. And when I say trained observers, these were not just university professors and their graduate students. We didn't, many of my colleagues have done studies like that. We weren't interested in knowing whether a college professor could identify effective teachers. We wanted to know whether trained observers, many of them former teachers, if they could receive training in a particular rubric, could they apply it well? Could they go into a classroom and give consistent scores on questioning technique, for instance? So on one of the instruments, a teacher would get a high score on their questioning technique if most of their questions required students to explain their answer, or if students asked each other questions, or if the students initiated some of the questions of the teacher. A teacher would get a low score on that if they asked a bunch of yes/no questions, and if the teacher was the source of all questions, the mediator of all questions, and the students weren't involved at all. Well, one of our questions was, could you train people to recognize excellent questioning technique and score it reliably? And what we found was, yes, their responses were related, but to get reliability required observing multiple times, so just one class lesson was not enough, and by using multiple observers. So we had to have 4 different observations to get to the point where we got a reliable measure out of the classroom observation instruments that we were using. So it's possible. Now, in this, we're not saying, this is one question I often get, is, hey, wait a minute, are you trying to argue that teaching can be broken down into just a discrete set of skills? No, I'm not saying excellent teaching could ever be broken down into, I couldn't parse every aspect of practice, but I do think that there are, or based on the evidence we've seen, there are particular general competencies that are associated with student achievement gains, and it is possible to give teachers feedback on those specific strengths and weaknesses. Third, we found that the student surveys, again, could provide feedback on specific aspects of practice, and that those responses were reliable in the sense of being consistent across different groups of students and predictive in that it was related to student achievement gains. And then fourth, we found that by combining all 3 of these, achievement gains, student surveys, classroom observations, that the teachers who scored better on that combination actually did better on their students when they worked with another group of students, had better outcomes on every measure we looked at. They had better outcomes on the state test. They had better outcomes on some supplemental tests that we gave that were intended to measure students' conceptual understanding. The students reported higher levels of effort. And actually, one of my co-authors in this work, I wish I had him here, because if he were here, you would know exactly what I'm talking about. He is somebody who just values children having fun. So we added some questions on. So for the elementary students, the question was, this class is a happy place for me to be. This friend of mine is the happiest guy I know. So we wanted to just see whether this was true. And actually the teachers with larger, who scored better on this combined measure, had students who were more likely to report that this class, was an enjoyable, experience. So it's not just that these measures would identify the teachers who were just drilling all the time. So now, this kind of work, even though this project was unusual in terms of its size, but even with that size, like a $50 million project, the payoff in terms of changes in policy, have been tremendous. So, 42 states and the District of Columbia have changed in the last few years their approach to teacher evaluation. Like I said, it remains to be seen how well that's done, but there is this process underway. And if you look at the teacher payrolls in those 42 states, they totaled $220 billion. So with $50 million, the Gates Foundation is leveraging a $220 billion per year government spend. In addition, the U.S. Department of Education created something called Race to the Top, which provided another $4.5 billion of money that, again, is many of the states that won Race to the Top funds are implementing lessons learned in this measures of effective teaching study. So this kind of work can leverage much larger changes in the public sphere if it's designed in a certain way. And we could talk about what are the aspects, what were the key aspects of a study that is most likely to have an impact on policy, if people are interested in that. I feel like we've learned something about that in recent years, and we could talk about that. But I just wanted to underscore how important the philanthropic community in the United States has been for the education reform debate there. So think about it. So there are all sorts of actors that have a vested interest in the current system. So any sort of voice for reform has to come from someplace, and in the U.S. that has been the loudest voice for reform, and I think the most effective voice for reform has come from the philanthropic community, which, in working in tandem with political leaders. But I would just applaud the work that the Lehman Foundation and Brava and IFHC is doing, and I'm sure there are other foundations that I know I've heard Dennis talking about that are doing important work here in Brazil. But I think that's going to be a critical part of finding the solutions going forward. Now, just my last slide. We are still working on some of the analyses. So we've released 2 reports so far, one focusing on the student surveys, one focusing on the classroom observations. We have at least 2 more reports coming out later this year. and so people should if you're interested, could keep an eye on this website, www.metproject.org. There are other resources there that people would be free to use. We described the observation instruments, so what was the approach to doing classroom observations that we did. We provide the student surveys, and then there's other software to help train and certify observers for doing classroom observations. So why don't I stop there? I look forward to discussion later, but again, thank you. This is clearly an exciting time in Brazil, and it's just been a huge pleasure for me to be here during this exciting time, and for this to be my first trip here is even makes it even more special. So thanks.